Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Luke Walmerink. I'm an attorney with Anderson, Dorn, and Rader. This is the second F.A.M.E event this year, so for all of you F.A.M.E members, thank you so much for attending this event. I promise this is going to be a good one. I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I'm going to introduce our speaker for the day and then let him take over from here. So it is my pleasure to introduce Scott Schweigert. Mr. Schweigert is the curator of art at the Reading Public Museum in Pennsylvania. He is a native Pennsylvanian and he has more than 20 years of curatorial experience. Before joining the Reading Public Museum, he was director of the Suzanne H. Arnold Art Gallery at Lebanon Valley College, where he also taught art and art history courses. He has curated exhibitions on a number of different very famous artists: James McNeill Whistler, Louis Comfort Tiffany, William Trost Richards. He's done exhibits on Pennsylvania Impressionism, German Expressionism, Spanish colonial paintings, contemporary Latin American art. Mr. Schweigert's primary area of expertise is in European art of the 17th century. Currently, there is an exhibit upstairs on the second floor here. It is called American Impressionism, The Lure of the Artist's Colony. It features a lot of the oil paintings and works on papers that are currently from the Reading Public Museum on loan out here for this exhibit. He will be speaking for about 45 minutes this afternoon. There will be some time at the end if you have any questions. He's going to stick around and answer some of those afterwards. So without further ado, Mr. Scott Schweigert.
Thanks, Luke. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here in Reno and wonderful to see the show upstairs in the galleries. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, please go up to the second floor and explore the exhibit, which is called The Lure of the Artist's Colony, American Impressionism. So today I'm just going to shed a little bit of light on what artist colonies were, where they flourished at the beginning of this period known as American Impressionism, what they allowed artists to do, and I've got some great historical photographs as well to go along with some of the paintings, so you'll get a sense of some of the flavor of what was happening in front of these easels and in these beautiful sort of bucolic settings in the East Coast and then spreading to the West in the United States. First, though, a little bit about the Reading Public Museum and how we came to own most of those paintings upstairs. The Reading Public Museum is home to a little-known treasure trove of works by American Impressionists featured in this current exhibition. This comprehensive gathering sheds light for the first time on one of the great strengths of our collection. The museum began collecting paintings, sculptures, and works on paper in 1913, about 9 years after its founder, Levi Mangle, who's this fellow right here, with the mustache and the glasses, made purchases of some 2,000 ethnographic objects from the natural history specimens from the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. So our collection is linked to the famous World's Fair in St. Louis, where Levi bought a bunch of exhibits from exhibitors from around the world, and that formed the nucleus of our collection. The generosity over the years of museum donors, wise purchases directly from artists, and acquisitions from the annual exhibits at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia built our fine art collection with an emphasis on American painting. Indeed, the Pennsylvania Academy and its cadre of talented artists and faculty loom large in the formation of Reading's collection between the years of the 19-teens and the 1930s. This was sort of the golden age of collecting for the museum. So I show you also a historical postcard showing the facade of our building, which was built in 1925, sort of a classical Beaux-Arts building that unfolds with symmetrical galleries on 3 different floors, and butterflies, which were part of Levi's personal collection. He had one of the leading collections of butterflies, Lepidoptera for you specialists, in the country. And actually, there's a newspaper clipping from about 1912, a year that's significant because of the Titanic sinking. Levi was expecting a delivery of butterflies from India that were traveling on the Titanic. So they went down with the Titanic. His son was also expecting a delivery of stamps. He was an avid stamp collector, and those stamps went down as well with the Titanic. So there's sort of an interesting link there. And then down below is an early school group exploring the painting galleries in Reading. This photograph is probably from about 1913 or so. I mentioned the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts because it's only about 55 miles away from Reading, which is in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so they held annual juried exhibits. And at those juried exhibits, all of the major painters in the United States exhibited their work or wanted to exhibit their works. So it was an easy train ride for our curators and directors to go down there and make purchases. And so that's what they did. That's the famous furnace building from the 1870s, and a shot of one of the early classes at the Pennsylvania Academy. It's the oldest fine arts institution in the United States. It was founded in 1805, famously by the Peel family of painters. And so it was sort of the nexus of American painting and Impressionism as well. This show really brings together, for the first time, lyrical landscapes ranging from snow-covered hills to sun-filled harbors, seascapes, penetrating portraits, and remarkable still life paintings from the period of about the 1880s to about the 1940s. These are some historical photographs of plein air painting, which became popular in France really beginning in the 1840s and the 1850s, when commercial paints became available. So I'm talking about metal tubed paints that didn't have to be mixed in the studio. So it allowed artists to go outdoors, paint in the open sky, and sort of experience the effects of light and dark, atmosphere, morning, dusk, all of the four seasons, of course. So it really opened up the realm of possibilities for artists to capture the effects of light, one of the guiding principles of French Impressionism and, of course, of American Impressionism as well. When we talk about artist colonies, we can go back to the European example of the Barbizon painters who flocked to the forest of Fontainebleau, just outside of Paris, about 30 miles or so. So beginning around the 1830s through about the 1870s, artists in this group included Theodore Rousseau, Narcisse Diaz de la Peña, and Charles-François d'Aubigny. And there are some examples of their work. So this was sort of a brotherhood of painters who sort of escaped the rigors of the city and their studios, and went into the forest and painted out of doors. Again, it was the commercial availability of those ready-made paints that made this process possible. A little bit later in the century, too, of course, artists began to flock to Giverny, artists such as Claude Monet, who was followed by a group of American, Canadian, and other artists of other nationalities who gathered near the Hôtel Baudy near Giverny. And so Americans that went there include Jean Leslie Breck and Theodore Robinson. Monet was not the founder of the colony at Giverny, but certainly was among the most famous of its artists there. So in order to sort of bridge that divide between Europe and America, we included a section dedicated to American expatriate artists like Mary Cassatt, famously an American who exhibited with the French Impressionists. She was invited by Edgar Degas and the other French sort of rebels to exhibit in their alternative salons in the 1870s. And artists like John Singer Sargent, who had a studio in Paris and who painted for many of the famous American industrialists who were doing the Grand Tour at the time. Sargent also painted en plein air, or out of doors, and this is a view of him, a photograph of him painting at an easel outdoors. Up in the upper right, we see a wonderful view of his very elegant Paris studio that included all sorts of exotic artifacts and old masters. And then down below is the portrait, which is upstairs in the exhibit, which is a portrait of a man known as Niccolò d'Inverno, who was the artist's manservant. And so this is sort of a moment of quiet repose. So probably after dinner, the man is sort of quietly reading, and he's got his hand resting on his cheek. He's looking at a book that is sort of bathed in light. The figure himself is sort of in shadow, but his elbow and the book and the pages of the book sort of come into that very stark light. He's got something in his mouth, and this has been sort of a debate for a while, what that thing is in his mouth. I've heard everything from a cigarella to a cigar to even a vanilla bean, which were sometimes chewed after dinner as sort of a treat. I don't know what it is, but it's a wonderful sort of spontaneous, informal painting, but by an artist who is known certainly for his formal portraits of the aristocracy and of VIPs of the age. There's also a section in the exhibit dedicated to New York Impressionism, which was really rooted and grounded by William Merritt Chase, who had studied abroad. It was sort of standard practice for American artists to make the tour of Europe, mostly in Paris and in other European capitals. In the exhibit is this painting called My Palette, which includes one of the painter's palettes, his paintbrushes, a pouncing ball here, which was meant to transfer a drawing with pinpricks through it to a canvas. So an artist would do a preliminary drawing, put pinpricks through it, then pounce charcoal through it to sort of distinguish the outlines of the forms, and then use that as the basis of the formal painting in oil. Now, this painting also is important because it shows those commercially available tubes of paint, which so revolutionized this idea of being able to free up artists from the confines of their studio and let them paint under the sky. Speaking of studios, William Merritt Chase had a fantastic studio on 10th Street. He took over the studio from an earlier 19th century painter, but it was filled with, as you can see, sort of exotic trinkets and sort of objects of curiosity that the VIPs in New York City used to flock to. It was a way for him to cultivate clients. They got lured into the surroundings of this fantastic studio and often ended up either commissioning a portrait or buying paintings right on the spot. Now, Chase, in addition to this fantastic studio that he had in New York, he was also a teacher at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts and at other major art institutions. He's known as much for his paintings as he is for his as he is for being a teacher. And here is a view, an early photograph of him from the 1890s in his summer school at Shinnecock Hills in Long Island. And notice the gender of most of those students. They're women. And there are a lot of women painters represented in this exhibit as well. Now, the Reading Public Museum does not have a Shinnecock painting by Chase, but there are two lovely portraits and, of course, that still life. And we actually have one of William Merritt Chase's palettes. Not the one that's pictured in that painting, but another palette that he passed down to one of his students. Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania Academy was, of course, a nexus for American Impressionism. That, along with New York and Boston, formed sort of the nucleus of East Coast Impressionism in the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s. And so up there, again, is the facade of the historic building at PAFA. And then down below is an early exhibit of American Impressionist paintings, hung, of course, salon style, as was the fashion at that time. And on the right is a very grand portrait called Blue and Gold by Hugh Breckenridge that sort of epitomizes this particular period. I always look at this painting and think, I see neither blue nor gold in this, and I wonder how that title came about. But I challenge you to go up and find blue and find gold in this picture. It is a challenge. Hugh Breckenridge taught at the Academy for over 4 decades. Dozens and dozens of students who sort of took on the mantle of American Impressionism into the next generation. One of the great paintings upstairs in terms of atmosphere is Paulette Van Roken's Towers in the Mist. Again, Paulette Van Roken's is not a household name. This painting is from 1925, but what she's able to achieve with her composition is extraordinary. So you can tell what the atmospheric conditions are, right? It's just rained, the sidewalks are still wet, and they're reflecting both the lampposts and the sky as that storm has passed. Mist is rising above the streets. And this is a view of North Broad in Philadelphia. If you're familiar with Philadelphia, City Hall is, of course, the hub of Broad. And so this is a view down towards City Hall, which you see here. Here's a photograph, probably from the teens or the 1920s, based on the automobile here and the vehicle, sort of with that same view. But you can see, you can get to the essence at what artists like Paulette Van Roken's were getting at, this idea of trying to capture the fleeting moment and the atmospheric conditions of a particular mood or a weather condition or a period of day, morning, afternoon, dusk. You'll see a lot of snow scenes upstairs as well. Impressionists were wonderful at capturing those effects as well. And seasons. So here we are in fall in the rolling hills, either of Connecticut or of Pennsylvania. Charles Morris Young was born in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And if you've ever been to Gettysburg, it's filled with rolling hills with limestone outcroppings, just like this scene. But Charles Morris Young also studied at the Pennsylvania Academy, but he traveled to the Connecticut colonies as well at Cos Cob and Old Lyme during his career. This artist, a Canadian-born artist, George Agnew Reid, came to Pennsylvania to study with perhaps the most famous artist at the end of the 19th century, who was a teacher at the Pennsylvania Academy, known as Thomas Eakins. And so he came to study with Thomas Eakins, and he met his wife there, Mary Heaster Reid, who happened to be a resident of Reading and a fellow student at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. This is one of the most wonderful portraits in the show, and it is of his wife, Mary Heaster Reid, and it's taken at a moment in sort of afternoon light, sun dappled through the trees. You can see it falling on her shoulder here and on her hands. She's wearing a wonderful creamy lace dress with a blue sash, wildflowers rising up here right next to her with blue blooms that match that sash perfectly. She's also got a silk ribbon around her neck, which ties the color theme all the way up through. We don't see her face, which makes it even more alluring to us. She's sort of turned away from us, and she's holding something in her hand. Looks like a group of papers and perhaps a fan in her hand as well. And she's wonderfully positioned in front of a screen of dark pines, and we get this little hint of sky and daylight to her right. The subject of that painting was also a painter, and this is her hollyhocks on the right, and a much more tonalist view on the left of a flock of sheep. Tonalism was related to Impressionism. The color palette in tonalism, though, was limited to a monochromatic range of sort of browns, greens, blues. In this case, we get the idea that it's sort of dusk or dawn as this group of sheep is framed by trees on left and right. The Hollyhocks is a wonderful garden painting with all sorts of blooms in the foreground. Sort of the vertical format really helps since hollyhocks grow tall in the summer. And so again, it's about observing nature, about painting outdoors, understanding the effects of light and dark, and the various atmospheric conditions. Richard Blossom Farley was also a painter who studied at the Pennsylvania Academy, but he made his reputation for painting sort of society portraits of Philadelphians in this way. And this portrait, which is extraordinary, shows us a very rich interior, the upholstered settee, and all of the textiles of the figure's silk dress, the hair ornament, the jewelry sort of marking her status in society. And again, she's not engaging directly with the viewer. She sort of seems to be in thought, her eyes cast downward, almost feeling uncomfortable as the subject matter of the painting. Look at that wonderful wall covering in the background, sort of like a William Morris wall covering or wallpaper, which reflects sort of the late Victorian interior design at that time period. Again, though, painted with really loose handling of the paint, thickly laid down in what's called impasto. We can really see the layers of paint laid down on that canvas right before your eyes. Now, not surprisingly, the Reading Public Museum includes a very large representation of painters of the so-called New Hope or Bucks County School of American Impressionists, which was founded at the beginning of the 20th century. New Hope is right along the Delaware River and provided wonderful views of the river and the hills of New Jersey beyond. The founder of the New Hope colony was William Langston Lathrop, whose muskrat hunter you see down here in the lower right. That too is sort of in the tonalist mode of Impressionism, where there's a very limited palette of browns and greens, and you can just barely make out that muskrat hunter here in the creek. And the composition is divided with about 3/4 sky and about 1/4 land. And this was the tradition in the Dutch Golden Age. Artists like Vermeer and Van Gogh and others sort of practiced the same technique. So again, a pared down palette. But he had come to New Hope. He bought a property at Phillips Mill. His wife was English, and so they hosted a Sunday tea for artists and for students that sort of became legendary. So again, these artist colonies, like New Hope, like the ones in Connecticut at Cos Cob and Old Lyme, like the ones in Massachusetts, they allowed artists to sort of let down their hair, to experiment, to exchange ideas with other artists, allowed them to earn a little bit of extra money by teaching summer classes, taking on additional students, expanding their realm of clientele, and it freed them up from the rigors of their city studios. And so I think for many of these artists, it was a way for them to reinvigorate their attitudes about their own art, and to explore new styles and new techniques That was an extraordinarily important thing that happened at these artist colonies. And so you see it, you see this idea take off with a rapid succession. So an artist like Lathrop shows up, buys a property at New Hope. Shortly after that, Edward Redfield, who is represented by at least 3 paintings upstairs, he too comes to New Hope and buys a property and starts painting the rolling hills of Bucks County and the Delaware, which you see beyond right here. This is a sort of quintessential Bucks County late 18th century limestone farm, the rolling hills. And if you get up close to this painting, you see the way that he's laid down the paint. It's almost like taffy. It's just laid on with such thickness and texture that the surface of the paint actually becomes topographical itself. It's an extraordinary thing to behold. So after Redfield comes, it sort of takes off as an art colony. Now, Redfield was a brave soul. He was famous for going out into all sorts of weather conditions in the dead of winter. He would take out sometimes very large canvases, 30 by 40 inches, strap them to trees in windy and blizzard conditions, and paint a single painting in what he called one go. And that meant he would finish a painting in a day. A very large painting in a day. He would pack his lunch, but often would come home with it uneaten because he got so wrapped up in his own work that he forgot to eat lunch. He was so wrapped up in what he was doing. Here are some views of Lathrop surrounding by a group of students. This is around 1902, and up above is Redfield at work. Outdoors from about 1930 or so. And again, Redfield painting outdoors at his easel. He worked directly from nature, completing his paintings in one go, as he called them. Now, Garber was the third major artist to settle in New Hope. He's represented upstairs by this wonderful painting called Goat Hill, which shows a view of the Delaware with the quarries right here on the other side. So this is looking toward New Jersey from Pennsylvania. And here's Garber painting at his studio in Lumberville in the Delaware Valley. This painting is extraordinary because it's tapestry-like. And so you'll see patches of color, and you'll also see areas that are very tightly and highly finished with their painting technique. And then you'll see areas like this where you see raw canvas coming through and very loose brushstrokes laid down to suggest trees and foliage. It's sort of like a patchwork quilt. And then, of course, you get the reflective quality in the river, and then the color and the shadow on this side of the shore versus that late afternoon, late day, sort of the golden hour light that we all love at dusk, taking full advantage of that. So you see those golden, peachy salmon hues really setting in. Robert Spencer and Fern Coppage were also painters of the New Hope School. And one thing that you can see, even through these images, is this idea that there's no single definition of Impressionism. Each artist has their own vocabulary and their own approach to Impressionism. Now, the tenets stay pretty much the same, this idea of loose brushstrokes, interest in light and shadow, interest in atmospheric conditions, thickly laid down paint, high key colors, Those things sort of remain true, but the individual styles of each of these artists is unique and extraordinary. So there's not a single definition of Impressionism, which is wonderful, I think. Each artist has his or her own voice, and you can see that coming through, especially when there are multiple examples by a single artist. Now, Fern Coppage, she painted with a group of women painters in Philadelphia, known as the Philadelphia 10, along with Cora Smalley Brooks, who is also represented in the exhibit upstairs. But her influence and her sort of stepping off point is this idea of the use of arbitrary color. So these riverside cabins that are these golds and greens, those are not the natural colors of those cabins. She has envisioned that in her artistic mind. Now, Robert Spencer, his paintings always include either factories, tenements, or dilapidated buildings. And he thinks paintings look lonely without structures. Even though there's no people in these, he's included, as you can see, this group of buildings that includes factories, and apartment buildings as well across the river. And his unique brushwork shows the broken style where you can see those individual brushstrokes. You can really sort of trace the artist's work through the brushstrokes. Then there's an artist like Walter Scofield, whose, again, approach has a very limited palette here. Look at the range of greens there. It's almost all there is, greens and browns. But yet he's able to convey this idea of texture and movement and light and shadow in this composition. Winter looms large in the New Hope School, not surprisingly. Pennsylvania is often snow-covered, sometimes as early as October, and sometimes as late as April. Spring, the first day of spring this year, brought us snow in Pennsylvania. So not a surprise that, and you guys are no stranger to snow, I know, as well. But, you know, the canals and the locks, Fred Wagner and his view of the canal at New Hope. And again, he was drawn to the industrial side of things. Impressionism isn't always pretty. It sometimes is gritty, and I like that range that we see. Charles Rosen, another New Hope artist. Here we got this beautiful screen of trees, and again, looking across the Delaware to that other shore that is just bathed in wonderful afternoon light. One of the few nocturnal views in the exhibit is by John Fulton Follansbee. This is from about 1926, after he had gone to London and to Paris and been exposed to the moderns, the so-called moderns, who were at work there. And this is a view, again, of the Delaware in snow. You can sort of feel the cold in this painting with those blues and whites. And then the lights sort of shimmering and being reflected in the water. Industry is present as well, so we see smoke rising up. So nature is balanced with man's influence, so the industrial world is present. Arthur Watson Sparks is a little-known artist who actually grew up in Washington, D.C. He taught at Carnegie, the Carnegie Institute, which became the Carnegie Mellon, and exhibited regularly at the Pennsylvania Academy and at the Carnegie annual exhibits. This is a view of France. Again, wonderful capture of light and shadow. Again, that late day afternoon light and the reflections in the water are truly extraordinary. So make sure you spend time looking at Sparks. He painted too for a brief period around 1918 in New Hope with the New Hope artists. Moving up the coast, Cos Cob in Connecticut was an art colony founded by Twachtman, John Henry Twachtman, and this is a historical photograph of him at the Palmer and Duff shipyard right around the turn of the century, around 1897. And on the right, a painting by Twachtman that is included in the exhibit upstairs. Twachtman and Robert Reid were among the early painters at Cos Cob. Cos Cob is a sort of a neighborhood of Greenwich, Connecticut, right along the water. And so it provided great marine views and views of the rolling hills of southern Connecticut as well. Ernest Lawson painted there as well. Lawson was part of a group of American painters known as the 10, who some of whom became Ashcan School painters like Robert Henry and John Sloan, who painted urban scenes of New York right around the turn of the century. This is a view of the Harlem Bridge crossing the Harlem River in upper Manhattan in snow, of course. Old Lyme in Connecticut, farther up the coast, was another art colony that was occupied by artists that ranged from Guy Wiggins to Childe Hassam. Childe Hassam, of course, is one of America's best-known American Impressionists, and this is a view of his beach at East Hampton in New York. So, and the view by Wiggins is not at Old Lyme, but is at Gloucester in Massachusetts, which also was a magnet for artists as well. A lot of these artists moved from colony to colony because they made friends and they said, oh, you should come up here and paint. There's some wonderful views and great subject matter for you. And so they did. They moved around quite a bit. Florence Griswold's home and boarding house at Old Lyme was, of course, the nucleus for that art colony, and Henry Ward Ranger was among the founders of the colony at Old Lyme. Florence Griswold provided housing and studio space, and her house actually became an art gallery each summer for artists and students to exhibit the work that they had created there. And we see here a photograph of an outdoor painting class at Old Lyme, again, right around the turn of the century. Chauncey Foster Rader is represented by at least two paintings upstairs, two very large paintings. Again, this view in fall, this is the road to Deering, and on the right is after an April shower, which again really has qualities to it that make us think, geez, that could be a French Impressionist painting by Pissarro or Monet. It certainly has those characteristics and those qualities. But by the turn of the century, most Americans had been exposed to French Impressionism, which really had its origins in the late 1860s. By the 1870s, the group was exhibiting together, and among its earliest patrons were some of America's great art patrons. So it made the transition, it crossed the Atlantic relatively early, and the French Impressionists received a warm welcome by American collectors. So it's not a surprise that American artists took up the style rather quickly. And then, of course, Massachusetts and Cape Cod, Rockport, Cape Ann, Gloucester, and Provincetown, and Boston became centers for art colonies as well. This is a view by Frank Benson on Grand River, where the artist has sort of activated the movement of the water with the brushstrokes. Work on the right by Charles Groupet, who painted in Massachusetts as well, up in Gloucester, but who had spent a lot of time in Europe and in Holland, and this is homeward bound. Provincetown was home to no less than 4 summer art schools. And so these are some historical photographs of schools. Webster had a school there, and Hawthorne did as well. And again, they painted outdoors. They painted seaside. They painted the docks and as the fishing boats were coming in. There was no lack of subject matter, especially at these port towns. This is a wonderful painting by Charles Webster Hawthorne from around the 1890s. Hawthorne had been William Merritt Chase's assistant student at the Shinnecock School in Long Island before he founded his own school of summer school of painting at Provincetown in Cape Cod. And so this painting is an important one. Shows sort of the quintessential American Impressionist painting: a woman in white, a white dress, of course, sitting under a tree, dappled sunlight, loose brush work laid on very thickly in pasto, high key color. So her hat, her straw hat, is next to her. It's got a ribbon around it and floral ornament. She's looking off sort of in this contemplative mode, and it just sort of typifies the best of American Impressionism. He's also dedicated it. At the bottom it says, "To my master, William Merritt Chase." So you can't get much better than that, a dedication to your master by a student. Now later, his style, there's another painting, another portrait of a woman in the show, and his style changed. About 20 years later, you get this idea that modernism was beginning to creep into his body of work. And so that work is very different, but is a wonderful comparison. Here's Hawthorne demonstrating for one of his summer classes. Again, look at the gender of most of the students. Many of them are women. And up above, this is Edwin Ambrose Webster's Plein Air School at Provincetown as well. Rockport artist from about 1888. And you can see them, they're dressed very formally, as was the custom, but you can see their faces are tanned from being out under the sun and painting. And then another view of a class sort of along the banks overlooking the water. So the East Coast, all of these colonies were in striking distance of major cities, so either Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. But there was also a wave of colonies that sent artists to the West to explore and to take in the natural beauty of the area not too far from here. And so it's wonderful that our show also includes representatives from the Taos, New Mexico art colony. So an artist like Walter Ufer or Irving Cows, who took the North American Indian as their subject, and of course the natural beauty of the American Southwest. These artists who had come out, some of them had come out to follow the movement west. Some of them had come out because the railroads opened up the possibility of travel to the west. But they weren't the first artists to come out. Of course, artists like Bierstadt and others had in the 19th century come out to the American West to explore as well. These are some great historical photographs of the founding members of the Taos Society of Artists, including Cows, Blumenschein, Benninghaus, Sharp, Phillips, and Dunton. And then on the lower right, a critique of Cows's painting, The White Goose from 1912. So again, you can get a sense of what these colonies were like. They were, an outdoor critique of a painting. Again, if an artist is working alone in a studio, completing commissions for his clients, he's not able to do those things that he is at an artist colony. This is my favorite photograph. I love this. Members of the Taos Society artists clowning around for the camera in Cows's studio. So they're, sort of dressing up with studio props that were used in some of the compositions. And so from left to right, it's Blumenschein, Sharp, Phillips, Benninghaus, Dunton, and Cows is on the right with that blanket around his head, which I love. And then finally, as part of the exhibit, California Impressionists like Colin Campbell Cooper, who was an East Coast artist, but who came west after his wife died and painted places like Santa Barbara's El Encanto, the wonderful resort. And you can see the lotus pond here in his painting from the 1920s. And here is the lotus pond as it is today. It hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 90 years or so. Then, of course, the colonies at Monterey, William Went and Laguna Beach. So the idea of the artist colony spread westward by the 19-teens. Of course, on the East Coast, European modernism began to creep in the 19-teens and 20s, and it had supplanted Impressionism as the avant-garde style of the day, although some of the colonies continue, and of course, places like Provincetown, Rockport, Gloucester, Old Lyme are still magnets for artists today. I'm just going to end quickly with a little walkthrough of the Reading Public Museum, which is probably unfamiliar to most of you. We are in southeastern Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, about 55 miles to the north and to the west of Philadelphia. And so this is our facade, that Beaux-Arts facade that you saw in that early postcard. We added an atrium in the 1990s as a welcoming entrance. This was American Impressionism, the lure of the artist colony at our venue, and so this is what it looked like in our space. William Merritt Chase's section, New York Impressionism, the New Hope, Bucks County colony, and then the Massachusetts colonies as well. Here's that contrast of the Hawthorne Impressionist portrait and then the more modernist one from the 19-teens. About 20 years separate those paintings. And then these are the Connecticut colonies at Old Lyme and Cos Cob at our venue. This is a view of our American gallery. So we have paintings there from the 18th century to the early 20th century, including a great representation of the Hudson River School 19th century landscape painters. We've got a church, a Cropsey, and other well-known paintings. Portraits, Gilbert Stuart, Thomas Sully, Jacob Eichholz, and others. We also have early European art in our collection, so art from the late Renaissance into the Rococo, and so this is a view into the European galleries. France in the 19th century is well represented. This is a work by Julien Dupré, who painted in Breton and in Normandy, and it's a wonderful museum-sized painting that was exhibited in the Salon of 1886 in Paris, and shows a group of peasants looking up at a hot air balloon up here that's in the sky, which is wonderful. And it's flanked by a painting by Auguste Lermite. We've got a lot of European arms and armor as well in our collection, a Maximilian suit of armor from the early 16th century in Germany. We also have a Ptolemaic period mummy from Egypt here, a mummy and her sarcophagus lid. Her name is Nefrina, and she is a rock star at the museum. Generations of students have come to see her and sort of been repulsed and attracted at the same time to her gruesomeness. And we've got a great representation of Greek and Roman artifacts as well. Not surprisingly, lots of Pennsylvania German folk art and painted furniture, dower chests, painted tin, portraits, utilitarian objects, etc. Pre-Columbian Latin American as well from South and Central America. And then modernist works as well. This piece is by Keith Haring, well-known contemporary artist who passed away about 20 years ago or so. He was born in Reading at the hospital directly across the street from the museum. And he had some of his first exhibits at the museum. He went on, of course, to be a famous subway artist in New York City and sort of a neo-pop artist who came into the circle of Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat and others. Harry Bertoia is the designer of this sculpture and this chair as well. Harry Bertoia, mid-century designer, moved to Pennsylvania from California to work for Knoll Furniture, and he had a studio in Berks County as well. So we've got some great representation of native or resident artists as well. Look at our modern and contemporary gallery as well, and then the museum at night. So that's all I have, but I'm happy to take questions, and so glad you could come today.